In the early months of 1944, the dense jungles and rugged terrain of Burma became an increasingly critical battleground as the tides of World War II shifted decisively in favor of the Allied forces. Japanese troops, long entrenched in defensive positions throughout the region, faced mounting pressure from a multifaceted campaign designed to sever their supply lines and erode their capacity to sustain prolonged combat operations. The strategic landscape was marked by the British Royal Air Force's initiation of a series of nocturnal bombing raids, a calculated effort to exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in the Japanese logistical network and command infrastructure. These night raids represented not merely an escalation in the aerial component of the Burma campaign but a deliberate transformation in Allied operational doctrine, emphasizing disruption and attrition under the cover of darkness. The strategic imperative for the British night raids was rooted in the recognition that Japanese control over Burma depended heavily on an intricate system of supply routes, including critical rail lines, roads, and river networks that threaded through inhospitable terrain. Interrupting these arteries would not only degrade the Japanese ability to reinforce forward positions but also sap the morale of troops isolated by increasingly tenuous lines of communication. RAF bomber crews, operating under the command of seasoned officers, prepared to execute missions that required precision, endurance, and the ability to adapt to the unforgiving conditions of night flying in a tropical environment. The complexity of these operations was compounded by the need to navigate through monsoon weather patterns and avoid detection by Japanese radar and anti-aircraft systems, which, although formidable, were limited in efficacy during nocturnal engagements. From the outset, the British night raids signaled a strategic shift that would challenge the Japanese forces' assumptions about their operational security and air defense capabilities. Historically confident in their control of the Burma theater, the Japanese command structure had not fully anticipated the extent to which the RAF would leverage night operations to offset the limitations imposed by daytime air superiority contested by Japanese fighters. The night raids thus introduced a new dimension to the conflict, forcing Japanese commanders to re-evaluate the allocation of resources and the deployment of defensive assets. The RAF bomber units, comprising aircraft such as the de Havilland Mosquito and the Avro Lancaster, were tasked with precise targeting of Japanese supply depots, airfields, and command centers, with the explicit aim of crippling the enemy's ability to sustain frontline combat operations. The protagonists in this phase of the campaign were the RAF crews themselves, whose missions demanded not only technical skill but also a profound resilience in the face of perilous conditions. Navigators, bombardiers, and pilots worked in concert to execute coordinated strikes, often flying multiple sorties per night to maximize the cumulative effect on Japanese infrastructure. These airmen operated within a broader strategic framework devised by commanders who understood that the success of the night raids would hinge on maintaining operational secrecy and exploiting the element of surprise. The raids were meticulously planned to coincide with periods of reduced moonlight and adverse weather, conditions that both masked Allied movements and compounded the challenges confronting Japanese defenders. The initial strikes yielded tangible results, as Japanese supply lines began to fray under the sustained pressure of nocturnal bombardment. Rail yards, bridges, and storage facilities were rendered inoperative, necessitating time-consuming repairs and rerouting of supplies through less efficient channels. Japanese troops stationed in forward positions found themselves increasingly isolated, their resupply convoys vulnerable to air attack and ambush. The psychological impact of the night raids cannot be understated. Soldiers who had previously operated with a degree of confidence in the protection afforded by their rear echelons now faced the unsettling reality that the enemy could strike with impunity after dark. This erosion of morale was compounded by the cumulative effect of lost material and disrupted communications, which hindered command and control functions critical to coordinated defensive operations. The broader context of the Burma campaign during this period was characterized by a gradual but inexorable shift in momentum. Allied ground forces, bolstered by the air campaign, began to probe Japanese lines with increasing effectiveness. The night raids functioned as both a tactical and psychological weapon, undermining Japanese defensive cohesion and setting the stage for subsequent offensives aimed at reclaiming territory long held by Japanese forces. The RAF's ability to sustain these operations over extended periods reflected advancements in navigation technology, crew training, and inter-service coordination, all of which contributed to the growing dominance of Allied air power in the region. Japanese commanders, confronted with the escalating effectiveness of the British night raids, initiated a series of countermeasures designed to mitigate the damage and restore the integrity of their supply network. These included the deployment of night fighters tasked with intercepting RAF bombers, the enhancement of anti-aircraft artillery placements around critical installations, and the implementation of blackout procedures intended to obscure targets from aerial reconnaissance. However, These responses were often reactive and hampered by limited resources and inadequate intelligence regarding the timing and scale of Allied operations. The Japanese air defense infrastructure, while formidable in certain respects, struggled to adapt to the unique challenges posed by the sustained nocturnal bombardment. The operational environment of Burma, with its dense vegetation and mountainous terrain, further complicated both Japanese defensive efforts and Allied attack planning. Japanese forces had historically relied on terrain advantages to offset numerical and material disparities, but the advent of effective night raids diminished the protective value of geographic features. Bombing runs were able to target supply depots hidden within jungle clearings, while the destruction of critical bridges and rail junctions rendered natural obstacles into insurmountable barriers for Japanese logistics. This dynamic underscored the evolving nature of warfare in Southeast Asia, where technological advancements and tactical innovation increasingly dictated the terms of engagement. As the British night raids gained momentum, the cumulative operational challenges confronting the Japanese became more pronounced. The disruption of supply lines led to shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies at the front, impairing the combat effectiveness of Japanese units. Communication lines, reliant on both wired and wireless systems, suffered frequent interruptions due to repeated bombings of relay stations and command posts. These disruptions degraded the capacity of Japanese commanders to coordinate defensive maneuvers and respond to Allied offensives with agility. The strategic calculus within the Japanese high command began to reflect a growing awareness of their vulnerability to sustained air assault, prompting considerations of force redeployment and defensive consolidation. The RAF's night raids in early 1944 thus emerged as a pivotal element in the Burma campaign, marking a transition from conventional daytime engagements to a more complex, multidimensional conflict in which air superiority extended into the night. The careful orchestration of these raids demonstrated Allied ingenuity and adaptability, leveraging both technological and tactical advantages to impose severe operational constraints on Japanese forces. The bomber crew's perseverance in the face of hazardous flying conditions and persistent enemy defenses exemplified the determination underpinning the Allied effort to reclaim Burma. These operations not only inflicted immediate material damage but also initiated a protracted process of attrition that would ultimately erode Japanese control over the region. The initial phase of the night raids set the tone for subsequent Allied actions, embedding air power as a central component of the campaign's strategic framework. By weakening Japanese logistics and sowing uncertainty within their ranks, the RAF operations facilitated greater mobility and effectiveness for ground forces preparing to press the offensive. The night raids underscored the critical importance of integrated air-ground coordination and highlighted the limitations of Japanese defensive preparations in the face of a determined and technologically adept adversary. This stage of the Burma campaign thus stands as a testament to the evolving nature of warfare in Southeast Asia, where mastery of the skies increasingly dictated the course of battles fought amidst the jungles and mountains below. The execution of the British night raids on Japanese positions in Burma during 1944 reflected a meticulously coordinated effort characterized by precision targeting and relentless operational tempo. RAF bomber formations, operating chiefly under the cover of darkness, undertook calculated missions aimed at inflicting maximum disruption on critical Japanese installations, airfields, and logistical hubs that underpinned the enemy's regional dominance. These operations were not haphazard raids, rather, they were the product of extensive intelligence gathering, careful route planning, and the integration of advanced navigation techniques, which collectively enhanced the effectiveness of nocturnal bombing in a theater traditionally dominated by daytime engagements. The planning phase involved detailed reconnaissance and intelligence reports that identified key nodes within the Japanese supply and communication networks. Targets were selected based on their strategic value, including rail yards essential for troop movement, fuel depots that sustained mechanized units, and airfields that provided the Japanese with aerial reconnaissance and fighter cover. The RAF's ability to conduct these raids with relative regularity was facilitated by advances in radar navigation and the use of Pathfinder aircraft, which marked targets with flares and incendiaries to guide the main bomber force. This level of precision was critical, as indiscriminate bombing not only risked wasting limited munitions but also endangered the lives of Allied ground forces operating in proximity to these targets. The raids themselves were executed with a level of operational discipline that underscored the professionalism of the RAF crews. Bombers took off in staggered waves from airfields in India and Allied-controlled Burma, flying long sorties that required navigation through hostile territory and unpredictable weather. The nocturnal nature of the missions imposed unique challenges. Crews had to maintain formation in near-total darkness, avoid Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and deliver their payloads accurately despite the absence of visual landmarks. The use of aircraft such as the de Havilland Mosquito, known for its speed and maneuverability, proved advantageous in evading enemy defenses and conducting precision strikes. Meanwhile, larger bombers like the Avro Lancaster delivered heavier payloads, targeting infrastructure whose destruction would yield strategic dividends. In response, Japanese forces endeavored to bolster their defensive measures against the growing threat of night raids, deploying a combination of night fighters and enhanced anti-aircraft artillery batteries. However, these countermeasures were frequently insufficient to stem the tide of RAF attacks. Japanese night fighters, often operating in small numbers and limited by inferior radar and interception capabilities, struggled to locate and engage the swift and well-coordinated British bomber formations. The anti-aircraft defenses, while formidable in certain static locations, lacked the mobility and density necessary to provide comprehensive protection across the vast expanse of the Burmese theater. This disparity in night fighting capabilities highlighted a critical vulnerability in Japanese air defense doctrine, which had been primarily oriented towards daytime engagements. Moreover, the Japanese defense infrastructure suffered from logistical constraints that impeded the rapid deployment and maintenance of night fighting assets. The scarcity of trained personnel, compounded by the attrition of experienced pilots in earlier campaigns, limited the effectiveness of Japanese night interception efforts. Anti-aircraft units faced challenges in ammunition resupply and radar maintenance, factors that further degraded their operational readiness. The Japanese command's attempts to implement blackout protocols and camouflage measures around key installations were only partially successful, as the RAF's use of illumination flares and electronic countermeasures often penetrated these defenses, enabling accurate target acquisition. The operational challenges faced by Japanese forces during the night raids extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The disruption of supply routes caused cascading effects that strained the entire logistical apparatus. Damaged rail lines and destroyed bridges forced reliance on less efficient road transport, which in turn became more vulnerable to ambush and air attack. The cumulative effect was a growing bottleneck in the movement of reinforcements, ammunition, and essential supplies, which hampered the Japanese ability to mount coordinated counteroffensives or reinforce threatened sectors. Communication networks also suffered, as relay stations and command posts were repeatedly targeted, leading to delays and confusion in the issuance of orders. This sustained pressure exacted a heavy toll on Japanese troop morale. Soldiers, accustomed to the relative security of rear-area installations, found themselves increasingly exposed to the uncertainties of nighttime bombardment. The psychological strain of enduring frequent air raids in the dark, with limited warning or means of defense, eroded confidence in their command's ability to protect them. Reports from the front lines indicated a palpable sense of fatigue and apprehension, as the ever-present threat of destruction disrupted rest periods and undermined combat readiness. The night raids thereby functioned not only as a physical assault on infrastructure but also as a tool of psychological warfare, weakening the resolve of Japanese forces and diminishing their effectiveness in subsequent engagements. On the strategic level, the British night raids compelled the Japanese to reconsider their defensive posture and resource allocation. The necessity of diverting personnel and material to bolster air defenses around key installations reduced the strength available for frontline combat units. This reallocation of resources created vulnerabilities elsewhere, which Allied ground forces sought to exploit. Furthermore, Japanese attempts to repair damaged infrastructure often fell short due to the persistent threat of renewed bombardment, forcing a cycle of destruction and repair that sapped both material and human resources. The inability to secure critical supply routes over extended periods contributed to a gradual erosion of operational flexibility and initiative. The cumulative effect of these factors underscored the strategic acumen underpinning the British night raids. By targeting the logistical and command nodes that sustained Japanese operations, the RAF effectively undermined the enemy's capacity to wage war in Burma. The raids disrupted not only the physical infrastructure but also the intricate web of supply and communication that enabled coordinated defensive action. In doing so, they complemented the broader Allied strategy of combined arms operations, wherein air power was leveraged to create conditions favorable for ground offensives and eventual territorial reclamation. The Japanese response, while earnest, revealed critical limitations in their ability to adapt to the evolving nature of aerial warfare. The reliance on traditional daytime air defense tactics and the scarcity of specialized night fighting units rendered their efforts reactive and often ineffective. This gap in capability was exacerbated by the logistical difficulties inherent in the Burmese theater, where terrain and resource constraints hindered the rapid deployment and sustainment of defensive assets. As the night raids continued with increasing frequency and precision, Japanese commanders faced the harsh reality that their air defense posture was inadequate to counter the persistent and calculated British assault. The operational tempo maintained by the RAF during these nocturnal missions was a testament to the effectiveness of Allied training, coordination, and technological innovation. The integration of intelligence reports, radar navigation, and pathfinder techniques enabled the bomber crews to execute complex missions with a level of accuracy previously unattainable in night operations. This not only maximized the damage inflicted on Japanese installations but also minimized collateral damage and the risk of fratricide in areas where Allied ground forces operated in proximity. The sustained pressure exerted by these raids increasingly constrained Japanese operational options, setting the stage for subsequent phases of the Burma campaign. In sum, the British night raids of 1944 constituted a decisive operational initiative that exposed and exploited Japanese vulnerabilities in air defense and logistics. The raid's execution demonstrated a blend of strategic foresight, tactical innovation, and relentless operational pressure that challenged the Japanese command's ability to respond effectively. Japanese countermeasures, constrained by limited resources and doctrinal rigidity, were unable to arrest the degradation of their supply networks and morale. As the conflict in Burma progressed, the night raids would continue to shape the operational environment, influencing both the disposition of forces and the conduct of ground operations in ways that ultimately favored Allied objectives. The sustained British night raids exerted a profound and debilitating impact on Japanese military operations in Burma, crippling communication lines and severing the vital reinforcements necessary to maintain defensive cohesion. The Japanese command structure, reliant on the efficient transmission of orders and the steady flow of supplies, found itself increasingly paralyzed by the relentless aerial offensive that targeted the very arteries sustaining their war effort. The destruction of rail networks, bridges, and supply depots not only disrupted logistical frameworks but also created operational bottlenecks that translated into tangible vulnerabilities on the battlefield. These disruptions compromised the Japanese forces' ability to mobilize reserves, reposition units, and coordinate counterattacks, cumulatively eroding their combat effectiveness. Japanese defensive positions, once bolstered by the strategic advantage of interior lines and robust supply channels, began to deteriorate under the pressure of repeated night raids. The degradation of infrastructure meant that frontline units suffered from shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, thereby diminishing their capacity to hold ground against increasingly aggressive Allied assaults. The cumulative attrition inflicted by these raids exposed critical weaknesses in the Japanese defensive perimeter, rendering formerly secure positions susceptible to penetration and encirclement. This erosion of defensive integrity was exacerbated by the psychological toll exacted on troops who faced the constant threat of nocturnal bombardment, undermining morale and cohesion. Air superiority during nighttime operations emerged as a decisive factor in this phase of the Burma campaign. The RAF's ability to dominate the skies after dark effectively neutralized Japanese efforts to conduct reconnaissance and provide aerial support to ground forces. Japanese aircraft, constrained by limited night fighting capabilities and hampered by the destruction of airfields, were unable to contest the RAF's dominance, thereby conceding control of the nocturnal operational environment. This imbalance allowed Allied forces to conduct interdiction missions with impunity, further isolating Japanese units and constraining their tactical options. The resulting disruption of command and control networks created a feedback loop of operational inefficiency and vulnerability. Several key battles during this period illustrate the direct influence of the British night raids on the course of the campaign. For example, the Japanese defensive efforts around Mandalay were significantly compromised by the repeated destruction of supply lines and communication nodes, impeding their ability to reinforce and resupply embattled units. Similarly, at the Battle of Meiktala, the sustained aerial interdiction of Japanese logistics played a critical role in the eventual Allied victory, as Japanese forces found themselves unable to mount effective counteroffensives due to depleted resources and fractured command structures. These engagements underscored the strategic value of the night raids as force multipliers that amplified the impact of ground operations. The operational challenges induced by the night raids extended beyond immediate tactical setbacks, precipitating broader strategic consequences for the Japanese war effort in Burma. The disruption of supply chains compelled Japanese commanders to initiate forced withdrawals from forward positions, often under duress and without adequate preparation. These retreats not only ceded valuable territory but also strained the already stretched Japanese forces, leading to disorganization and increased susceptibility to Allied pursuit. The cumulative effect was a gradual contraction of Japanese operational reach and influence within the theater, diminishing their capacity to mount sustained resistance. This phase of the campaign also highlighted the limitations inherent in Japanese defensive doctrine, which emphasized static fortifications and rigid command hierarchies ill-suited to the dynamic challenges posed by sustained air interdiction. The inability to adapt rapidly to the evolving operational environment rendered Japanese units increasingly vulnerable to encirclement and destruction. The degradation of communication networks further impeded the flow of intelligence and orders, resulting in delayed responses and missed opportunities to counter Allied advances. These vulnerabilities were exploited systematically by Allied commanders, who integrated air power and ground maneuvers to capitalize on Japanese disarray. The British night raids thus served as a catalyst for a broader transformation in the Burma campaign, shifting the balance of power by exposing and exploiting Japanese operational deficiencies. The cumulative attrition inflicted upon Japanese supply lines and defensive positions eroded their capacity to sustain prolonged combat operations, setting the stage for subsequent Allied offensives. The RAF's dominance of the night airspace not only denied Japanese forces the opportunity to regroup but also facilitated the projection of Allied power into previously contested areas, accelerating the pace of the campaign. Moreover, the disruption of Japanese communication and logistics networks had a profound impact on troop morale. Soldiers isolated by destroyed supply routes and cut off from command suffered from diminished confidence and combat readiness. The pervasive sense of vulnerability engendered by the night raids contributed to a decline in unit cohesion and effectiveness, further compounding the difficulties faced by Japanese commanders. This psychological dimension of the campaign was as significant as the physical destruction wrought by the raids, underscoring the multifaceted nature of the Allied air offensive. The operational environment in Burma during this period was characterized by a growing asymmetry in capabilities, with Allied forces increasingly leveraging technological and tactical advantages to impose their will. The British night raids exemplified this shift, demonstrating how air power could be employed not merely in support of ground operations but as an independent instrument of strategic disruption. The targeting of logistical nodes and communication centers underscored the evolving understanding of warfare in the theater, where mobility, supply security, and command integrity became decisive factors. In addition to the immediate tactical effects, the night raids precipitated a re-evaluation within the Japanese high command regarding the viability of their defensive posture in Burma. The persistent degradation of supply lines and communication networks forced consideration of alternative strategies, including the consolidation of forces and the prioritization of more defensible positions. However, these adjustments were often reactive and constrained by the cumulative toll exacted by the raids. The erosion of operational flexibility limited the Japanese capacity to mount effective countermeasures or to exploit opportunities presented by Allied vulnerabilities. The strategic significance of the night raids became increasingly evident as the campaign progressed. By systematically undermining Japanese operational capabilities, the RAF facilitated the conditions necessary for successful ground offensives, enabling Allied forces to regain key terrain and disrupt Japanese defensive depth. The interplay between air interdiction and ground maneuvers exemplified a combined arms approach that leveraged the strengths of each domain to compensate for the challenges posed by Burma's geography and climate. Ultimately, the British night raids in Burma during this phase of the campaign stand as a testament to the transformative impact of air power on modern warfare. The ability to disrupt enemy logistics and command structures under the cover of darkness challenged traditional notions of battlefield security and forced a fundamental reassessment of operational doctrine. The campaign highlighted the importance of maintaining flexible and resilient supply chains, effective communication networks, and adaptive defensive strategies in the face of evolving threats. This period also underscored the human dimension of warfare, as the physical destruction wrought by the raids was compounded by the psychological strain imposed on Japanese soldiers and commanders alike. The cumulative effect of isolation, uncertainty, and attrition contributed to a decline in morale that had tangible operational consequences. The British night raids thus operated on multiple levels, combining material destruction with psychological pressure to achieve strategic objectives. In sum, the night raids severely compromised Japanese military operations in Burma by disrupting supply and communication lines, degrading defensive positions, and diminishing troop morale. These effects directly influenced key battles and facilitated a broader shift in the campaign's momentum. The RAF's dominance of nighttime operations emerged as a critical factor in undermining Japanese control, illustrating the evolving nature of warfare in the Southeast Asian theater and the decisive role of air power in modern combined arms campaigns. The successful execution of the British night raids marked a decisive turning point in the Burma campaign, providing the Allied forces with a strategic advantage that extended beyond the immediate disruption of Japanese logistics and communication networks. The tangible effects of these nocturnal bombardments created conditions conducive to more assertive and coordinated ground offensives, as weakened Japanese positions became increasingly susceptible to sustained pressure. Allied commanders capitalized on the momentum generated by the night raids, integrating air power with infantry and armored units to exploit the vulnerabilities exposed by the persistent aerial campaign. This shift in operational dynamics underscored the evolving nature of warfare in the theater, where superiority during nighttime operations became a force multiplier for ground forces. The synergy between air and ground operations manifested in a series of offensives that systematically reclaimed territory previously held by Japanese forces. With supply lines severed and communication hampered, Japanese units found it increasingly difficult to mount effective resistance or orchestrate counterattacks in response to Allied advances. The interdiction of reinforcements and material by the RAF night raids facilitated a reduction in Japanese defensive depth, enabling Allied troops to breach defensive perimeters with comparatively fewer casualties. The ability to project power across multiple domains simultaneously reflected a maturation of Allied combined arms doctrine, emphasizing coordination and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses illuminated by air reconnaissance and interdiction. One of the critical advantages gained by the Allies was the erosion of Japanese operational reach. The persistent pressure exerted by the night raids forced Japanese commanders into reactive postures, often necessitating forced withdrawals or the consolidation of forces into smaller, more defensible enclaves. These strategic recalibrations diminished Japanese capacity for offensive action and limited their ability to contest Allied territorial gains. The reduction in Japanese operational flexibility also impaired their capacity to respond to shifting battlefield conditions, granting Allied forces the initiative and tempo necessary to dictate the pace of the campaign. The integration of air power with ground maneuvers was further exemplified by the use of close air support and interdiction missions that targeted Japanese retreat routes and assembly areas. The RAF's control of the night skies, combined with daytime air superiority, allowed for continuous pressure on Japanese forces, disrupting attempts to regroup or counterattack. This comprehensive aerial dominance diminished Japanese morale and logistical resilience, contributing to the progressive erosion of their defensive capabilities. The ability to sustain such operations over extended periods underscored the logistical and technological sophistication of the Allied air campaign, which maintained high sortie rates and operational readiness despite the challenges posed by the Burmese environment. From the Japanese perspective, the sustained air pressure necessitated significant strategic adjustments. The imperative to defend critical supply routes and installations against night raids compelled the diversion of resources and personnel away from frontline combat units, weakening their combat strength. Additionally, the increasing vulnerability of rear-area logistics hubs forced Japanese planners to reconsider the deployment of forces, often resulting in the withdrawal to more defensible terrain or the abandonment of exposed positions. These recalibrations reflected an acknowledgement of the limitations imposed by Allied air power and the need to mitigate further losses through defensive consolidation. The cumulative effect of these strategic shifts was a contraction of Japanese operational scope and a corresponding expansion of Allied influence across Burma. The night raids had effectively undermined the Japanese capacity to sustain prolonged defensive operations, facilitating a series of advances that gradually reclaimed territory and disrupted the cohesion of Japanese forces. This progression exemplified the critical role of air power in modern warfare, where control of the skies enabled not only direct destruction of enemy assets but also the shaping of the broader operational environment in favor of ground forces. Moreover, the psychological impact of the night raids persisted as a significant factor influencing Japanese strategic decisions. The constant threat of nocturnal bombardment eroded confidence among commanders and troops alike, fostering a climate of uncertainty and apprehension. This atmosphere complicated efforts to maintain discipline and morale, particularly as supply shortages and communication breakdowns compounded operational difficulties. The cumulative strain on Japanese forces contributed to a decline in effective resistance, further facilitating Allied advances and territorial gains. The night raids also demonstrated the efficacy of sustained air operations in challenging terrain characterized by dense jungle and mountainous landscapes. The disruption of supply lines and command centers within such environments underscored the limitations of traditional defensive strategies reliant on natural barriers and fixed fortifications. Allied air power effectively negated these advantages, enabling the projection of force into areas that had previously been difficult to contest. This operational flexibility expanded the strategic options available to Allied commanders and constrained Japanese defensive planning. The success of the night raids catalyzed a broader shift in the Burma campaign's strategic calculus, emphasizing the necessity of integrated air-ground operations to achieve decisive results. The RAF's ability to maintain pressure on Japanese supply and communication networks during the night complemented daytime air superiority and ground offensives, creating a continuous cycle of attrition and exploitation. This approach highlighted the importance of coordination among different branches of the military and the value of intelligence-driven targeting to maximize operational effectiveness. Japanese strategic recalibrations in response to the night raids included attempts to fortify remaining supply routes and to enhance air defense capabilities. However, these measures were often insufficient to reverse the operational disadvantages imposed by Allied air dominance. The increasing difficulty of maintaining secure lines of communication and logistics limited Japanese operational reach and flexibility, compelling commanders to adopt defensive postures that prioritized preservation over initiative. These adjustments, while necessary, further ceded the operational initiative to Allied forces and facilitated continued territorial gains. The interplay between the night raids and ground operations also influenced the planning and execution of subsequent Allied offensives. The intelligence gathered from aerial reconnaissance and the damage assessment of bombing missions informed decisions regarding the timing, direction, and scale of ground attacks. This integration of air and ground intelligence allowed for more precise targeting of Japanese vulnerabilities and minimized unnecessary exposure of Allied troops to fortified positions. The overall effect was a more efficient and effective campaign that leveraged the strengths of each service branch. In practical terms, the night raids enabled the Allies to capitalize on Japanese weaknesses exposed by disrupted supply and communication networks. Ground forces exploited breaches in defensive lines created or facilitated by the destruction of logistical hubs, while the continual threat of air attack prevented Japanese forces from regrouping or reinforcing threatened sectors. This operational synergy accelerated the pace of the campaign and contributed to the gradual unraveling of Japanese control in Burma. The strategic advantages accrued from the night raids extended beyond immediate battlefield successes, influencing the broader trajectory of the Southeast Asian theater. The experience gained in coordinating complex night bombing operations under challenging conditions informed subsequent Allied campaigns and highlighted the transformative potential of air power in modern combined arms warfare. The lessons learned underscored the necessity of integrated planning and the exploitation of technological advantages to achieve strategic objectives. In sum, the British night raids in Burma facilitated a significant shift in the campaign's momentum by enabling more effective ground offensives against weakened Japanese positions. The integration of air power with coordinated ground operations maximized the impact of the raids, undermining Japanese defensive cohesion and forcing strategic recalibrations that favored the Allies. These developments illustrated the evolving nature of warfare in the theater and the critical role of sustained air superiority in shaping operational outcomes. The British night raids on Japanese positions in Burma stand as a decisive factor that irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the Southeast Asian theater during World War II. These operations systematically undermined Japanese control by eroding their logistical networks, crippling communication channels, and sapping troop morale, thereby hastening the eventual Allied victory in the region. The significance of these raids transcends their immediate tactical and operational effects, embodying a broader evolution in air warfare doctrine that demonstrated the strategic value of sustained nocturnal bombing campaigns in complex environments such as the Burmese jungles and mountainous terrain. The campaign illuminated the vulnerabilities inherent in Japanese defensive preparations and exposed the limitations of their command structure when confronted with a multifaceted and persistent aerial threat. The Japanese reliance on static supply routes and fixed installations rendered them susceptible to disruption by precision bombing that targeted not only material but also the connective infrastructure essential for operational continuity. The British night raids capitalized on this weakness, severing the lifelines that sustained Japanese forces and thereby constraining their ability to mount effective resistance or adapt to shifting battlefield conditions. This degradation of Japanese operational capacity was a critical enabler for the broader Allied ground offensives that followed. From a strategic perspective, the effectiveness of the night raids underscored the transformative impact of air superiority in modern combined arms warfare. The ability to conduct sustained bombing operations under the cover of darkness complicated Japanese defensive calculations and diminished their freedom of movement. This operational advantage was leveraged not merely to inflict physical destruction but also to impose psychological pressure that eroded the will and cohesion of Japanese troops. The cumulative effect was a diminution of Japanese combat effectiveness that extended beyond the immediate losses incurred during individual raids. The campaign also demonstrated the importance of technological innovation and tactical adaptation in overcoming the challenges posed by the Burmese operational environment. Navigational aids, radar systems, and the employment of Pathfinder aircraft enabled the RAF to conduct accurate and effective night bombing missions despite the absence of visual cues and the presence of adverse weather conditions. These advancements not only enhanced mission success rates but also minimized collateral damage and preserved Allied operational security. The sustained application of these techniques contributed to the establishment of air superiority that was critical to the campaign's success. Furthermore, the British night raids highlighted the evolving nature of air power as an instrument of strategic interdiction, capable of shaping the operational environment in ways that directly influenced ground combat outcomes. By disrupting Japanese mobility and logistics, the raids forced the enemy into reactive postures and defensive consolidations that ceded initiative to Allied forces. This interplay between air and ground operations exemplified the emerging doctrine of joint warfare, wherein the integration of multiple domains facilitated decisive outcomes. The Burma campaign thus provided a case study in the effective employment of air power to complement and enhance ground operations. Post-war intelligence analyses corroborated the strategic impact of the night raids, confirming that the degradation of Japanese supply and command networks materially contributed to the collapse of their defensive perimeter in Burma. Intercepted communications and captured documents revealed the extent to which Japanese commanders grappled with the operational constraints imposed by sustained aerial bombardment. The loss of critical infrastructure and the consequent logistical challenges undermined Japanese strategic planning and diminished their capacity to respond effectively to Allied offensives. These findings reinforced the view that air superiority and interdiction were indispensable components of successful military campaigns in the theater. The lessons derived from the British night raids resonated beyond the immediate context of the Burma campaign, informing post-war military doctrine and the development of air power strategies in subsequent conflicts. The efficacy of night bombing in disrupting enemy operations without incurring excessive risk to friendly forces highlighted the value of technological innovation and specialized training for nocturnal missions. The integration of intelligence, electronic warfare, and precision targeting demonstrated during this campaign became foundational principles in the advancement of air warfare capabilities during the Cold War and beyond. Reflecting on the campaign, it is evident that the British night raids constituted a pivotal turning point in the Southeast Asian theater, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the war in Burma. The combination of strategic foresight, operational innovation, and relentless execution imposed insurmountable challenges on Japanese forces, contributing decisively to their eventual defeat. The campaign stands as a testament to the transformative power of air superiority and the critical role of integrated operations in modern warfare. The enduring significance of the British night raids lies not only in their immediate military outcomes but also in their demonstration of the multifaceted nature of strategic air power. By combining physical destruction with psychological and operational disruption, these raids exemplified a comprehensive approach to weakening an adversary's capacity to wage war. The campaign underscored the imperative of adaptability and resilience in the face of evolving threats, lessons that remain relevant in contemporary military strategy. In summation, the British night raids in Burma during 1944 epitomize a crucial evolution in air warfare, marking a transition from traditional daytime operations to a sophisticated, continuous assault on enemy infrastructure and morale under the cover of darkness. This campaign illuminated the strategic value of air power in limiting enemy mobility and supply chains, particularly in challenging terrain, and highlighted the necessity of joint operations to achieve decisive results. The legacy of these raids endures as a defining chapter in the history of the Burma campaign and as a foundational example of effective combined arms warfare in the 20th century.